Good evening. Welcome to tonight's devotional. First of all, my apologies. The devotional last night was a bit late in getting up. We had some problems with our internet. I'm also a little bit late in getting the announcements out, so those came out today rather than Saturday. So my apologies for those things. Please do look those up on our North Park Facebook page so you can stay aware of what is going on. Tonight we continue in our series on relationships, and we're still in Ephesians chapter 6 as it details out the three major relationships that we have in this life of spousal, of parental and child, and of master-slave, as it says in Ephesians, and the best context for us today is probably employee and employer. So today we're going to be finishing up the two parts of the one we started, which was children, obeying your parents and honoring them. And so tonight we're looking at fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. So a couple things to speak to right off the bat. Number one, why does it go from children obey your parents and honor your father and mother to simply fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. There should be parity as all these other relationships, wife and husband, master and slave. Then why not children and parents used in both? First of all, I would say it's a historical aspect, both in the Jewish culture at large and in the Ephesian culture. In that day and time, the writing of this letter, the fathers were the ones that were in charge of the education of their children. And so that was in large measure what the author of Ephesians, Paul, was responding to. In this patriarchal society where the father has the responsibility, fathers don't exasperate them. So that's the first thing to note. It does not say parents, though some people try to interpret it that way because the Greek word has that latitude. Within this context, the author intentionally changes from the generic term for parents to the one most often used for fathers. So there seems to be in this text this leaning towards fathers instead of parents in general. But if you go back to the reasoning why it says fathers, that fathers alone were the ones that had the responsibility of training and educating the child, then if we look at our historical context here in our time and place, our culture, then you know that that is not true anymore, that it is a shared responsibility. And so in that way, I would say that this applies to parents in general and not just fathers, for the exact reason that it applied to simply fathers back in the day that this was written. So it says, do not exasperate your children. So it starts from the position that the authority of the father, and in our instance, the authority of the parents, is an assumed reality. You have the authority to train up this child. So then it puts boundaries upon that authority. In fact, in many ways, what you see in these pairings of relationships is a mutual submission. And it's actually headlined that way at the very beginning of this section in verse 21 of chapter 5, where it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then it goes through how we are to submit to one another in these relationship pairings. Wives submitting to husbands, husbands submitting to wives, children to parents, parents to children, masters to slaves, slaves to masters, employees and employers in our context. And so what we see is that this is true of those responsible for bringing up the child, those who've been granted the authority over the children. God puts boundaries upon how we do that. The child is supposed to obey the parents as long as they are a minor, and they're supposed to honor the parents the entirety of their lives. Parents are supposed to bring up their children for their children's best good, not for their own convenience, not in a way that increases their laziness, the parents' laziness, but you're supposed to bring them up in a way intentionally for their best interest. You're not supposed to provoke them to anger. That doesn't mean you're ever going to be able to parent any child without ever making them angry. But it says very simply that you're not supposed to provoke them to anger. That's direct Greek translation. In the NIV here it says, do not exasperate your children. And so you're supposed to raise them in a way that is not harsh, that is not browbeating, that does not shame them. notice the similarity between how children are not supposed to shame their parents but bring them honor. So too the parents should bring up the child in a way that the parent is loving and honoring the child as a human being and not as property. Now, there are two mistakes people make in raising their children. Well, there's millions of mistakes, but I would say you can lump them into two categories. One, they fall into the ditch on one side where they are far too lenient. This nonsense of Dr. Spock that became popular several generations ago, that a child could self-raise, was insane. No, the action verb here is that the parents are supposed to train up the child. The child needs to be trained, disciplined. In fact, little Star Wars drop here. The word for this is paideia, which is the same kind of word as Padawan. So if you're a fan of Star Wars, you see that relationship of Padawan, disciple, learner, to the master, the Jedi, if you will. And so you definitely see how in those movies, Obi-Wan tends to exasperate Anakin and make worse his path to the dark side. I digress. That is way off topic. But I think you can see the sense of a relationship of authority and how that authority is supposed to be used for the improvement and betterment of the one over which you have authority. And you're supposed to honor them as a human being of their own worth and value, and realize that you're not supposed to exasperate, frustrate, or provoke them to anger, but in contrast, you are to train them up. You're to bring them up. In fact, in the Greek, it's almost like this. You're to bring them up in the upbringing of the Lord. And so it borders it. In Greek culture, in Ephesus at the day of this writing, it was assumed that the father had this authority and they were supposed to carry it out for the betterment of the child, that they were not to be overly harsh, but were to be gentle in their rebukes, disciplined, but with love. But what is added to the context then is that we are supposed to make them a Padawan of the Lord, of Jesus Christ, Paideia Christou, Paideia Kuriou actually here. And so you're supposed to bring them up in the discipline, in the training, in the instruction specifically of the Lord. And so this is my word to parents today. Do not leave the upbringing of your child to the school system and their coaches. God does not see that as sufficient. Take in hand their education, their training, their upbringing. Make sure you're being intentional and active about it. If this means you need to cut out a sport activity that they have or two so that you can actually have time with them, then do so, because you are far more important than a coach ever can be. I'm not meaning to degrade the role of coaches. I love sports and team activities. In fact, I was really disappointed that COVID didn't rob, I guess, but took away from my son Caleb what would have been his premier year in Little League. But if it comes down to whether or not you're going to be able to train your child up, or somebody else does, let it be you. And don't assume that making them go to church, or even better, taking them to church, is sufficient. You are to train them up in the way they should go, in the instruction of the Lord. If you are not communicating the truths of God to them, you are failing them as their parent. And if you don't understand the scriptures well enough, then that's the first step. I would highly encourage family devotionals to go on. If it's not this videotaped one, then you can simply pick up a Bible and question your way through it together while maintaining a significant devotion to the word of the Lord. So parents, do not exasperate your children, but rather bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And may our great God and King bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may you make sure the next generation is even better than the one before it. Thank you and good night.